Hey guys, hope you guys are doing well. So this week I sat down with my friend Vince Sierra and we had a pretty deep conversation about life, about church, about how we grew up and why we decided to stick with church instead of walking away when we feel like we had reasons to walk away at one point. So I know a lot of you guys have different feelings and different thoughts about what church is to you, and I understand that, respect that totally. But this is just our story, so I wanted to share it with you guys, and it gets pretty deep. So I hope you enjoy, and make sure you subscribe. Make sure you share this with somebody if you like it or if it affects you in a positive way. All right, thanks so much. Love you guys. Hope you guys have a great week. How would you say it was growing up in your family? Like, what did you guys have a religion? Did you have faith? Was it like, strict? Was it not strict? What was it like growing up?
So my family didn't grow up religious, meaning we didn't do anything like in any kind of discipline, right? Like we weren't constantly going to church. Mm-hmm. No one read their Bible. There was a cross in our house, and it was definitely, I would say, more creepy than it was like a symbol of hope. I'm not.
It was like a symbol of fear.
A little. Well, the cross in our house represented my sister's death, which we can talk about. I know that sounds. I don't want to make light of that, but it was like when my sister died, somebody had given my mom that cross, and that's what it hung there for. So we were always told as kids, like, "Hey, that's your that represents your sister." So the symbolic idea of a cross, like, wasn't like this great message of hope in some ways in our house. Does that make sense?
How old was your sister when she passed?
4 years old. 3 years old. Okay. So 3. She was. It was an accident. My parents one was in the house, one was outside. Somebody thought they were watching her, and we lived in an apartment complex, and a car backed up and ran her over. And so,
how old were you?
I was 1 year older, so I was 4.
Okay.
Yeah, so really, really young.
Right.
But and being parents now, I mean, you can only imagine what my parents went through, right? Like as a kid, I never understood it. It was really hard to comprehend the idea of them losing a kid and what that meant for them. But being an adult and having kids now, I'm like, wow, I lived through that.
That'd be tough, really tough. So, so you grew up in a household. Did you guys go to church? Did you guys talk about God, or was it just kind of like we believe, but we don't,
So Catholic roots, I would say. It was so my on my dad's side, my parents had some Catholic roots kind of growing up. Mm-hmm. My dad has a funny story I think I've shared with you about church. He walked into a church one day and the pastor stopped his service. He called it a reverend. He didn't say pastor, which I could tell that it was not a modern, definitely different. And he said the reverend stopped the service and was like, "I feel like an unholy presence." And my dad, so hearing the story from my dad, I'm like, it's like you're on the burst of laughter at any moment. Yeah, what is this story? And he says the reverend stopped the whole message, walked up to him, and be like, "You're the source of evil, you have to leave." And my dad said at that time he had a white t-shirt with cigarettes rolled up in his t-shirt. So I could just see my dad in there just oh yeah, acting all tough.
He was just hoping to go fishing afterwards.
He just wanted out of that place, let's be honest, for sure.
So did he not go to church because of that, or was it just that one bad experience kind of kept him out?
My parent, he wasn't raised religiously. He knew God. There was never any disgruntled, a bad taste of God in our household, which is interesting. After my parents lost, I would think they would be bitter and blame God for things. Growing up, my parents never ever had anything bad to say about God. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, it makes a lot of sense. I mean, that you'd think they would, but there had to be some sort of reverence there. I mean, it is interesting. So getting older, I know. So I met you. I think you were in junior high when I first met you. We didn't hang out or anything at that point, but I knew you as this little punk kid. And I mean, when I say punk, I mean literal punk. You had blue hair. You had blue matching Doc Martens. And you skated around all the time.
And lived on the east side of Bakersfield.
Yeah. And so I
just
remember you being one of the kids, one of those punky kids walking around. You and Ratliff.
Yeah, Joel James. Yep.
And so what brought you to church originally? How did you start coming? What?
So there was a kid in our neighborhood. Mm-hmm. And I'll come back to the lady part in a second. That makes more sense. Okay. So there's a kid in our neighborhood, and we were a little bit, like you said, we were punks, but also kind of mean-spirited kids. And so there was this one kid in the neighborhood that we just were this kid's annoying. So we would pretty much ride our bicycles by his fence every day and just yell insults at him, And so one day he got really, really tough. And this is happening right off Mountain Vernon, and I think it's Callaway is where I lived. I think
Callaway. It'd be
Alloway with an
Okay.
A. I think so. It's anyways. It sounds like Callaway. It's
Okay.
one of those. It's right. I went to Virginia Avenue School, so it was in
Okay.
that neighborhood right
Right.
there. So I was. He was yelling insults. And I thought it would be funny as he's yelling them through the fence because he has his face and his nose to the fence. I never knew what he looked like up until this day, which is hilarious. So I just walked up and just front kicked, just ninja kicked the fence, right? And it just blasted into his face. And he's screaming, ah! You know, you can see blood. My friends are all laughing.
gosh.
We're all trying to get away. You know when you do something
Yeah,
bad and you're on
yeah.
your bicycle gang as a kid and you're all trying to get away? It was like that scene, right?
Right.
Well, his parents, his mom knew where I lived. She knew exactly who I was. And so all of a sudden, I think I get away. Where all my friends are hiding in my house. We're all playing Nintendo. We're like, we got away. And there's a knock at my door. And my dad just comes running through the house. You know, Vince, where are you at? You know, he's all mad. And I already knew I was in trouble. I knew what it was. I walked to the door, and that kid's sitting there with his nose all busted. And the lady's like, hey, like, your kid did this. You know, he kicked the fence. And, you know, I'm gonna call the cops. Like,
Right.
you know, it was a whole thing. And so my parents got to talking. I'm sure they're negotiating their way out of this whole situation. And I just remember sitting there, just still thinking it was funny. This was me as a kid, right? I'm
Right.
just like,
Yeah.
that's what you get, kid. And the lady says, her name's Donna. Comes, I think she still comes to our church, but it's been there forever.
Yeah.
She said, Clag was her maiden name at the time. She said, you know what? How about he just goes to church with us? And in my mind, I'm like, oh, that's punishment. Like, no, like, go to church, what?
You're all, I'd rather pay. What do I need
Right,
to do?
do I need to go to jail
Medical
or go
bills.
to church? But my parents were like, yep, he's going to church. So they
Right.
didn't, like, say no to it. They're like, yeah, load him in the car and take him. Like, that sounds like a good idea. Well, anyway, she started taking me to youth group at the time, which at the time, Vicky was my teacher.
Oh.
Which is crazy. I don't
Vicky
even think you
Loman.
know like
Yeah,
how
I
far.
don't know.
And so that's when like I kind of started going to church. Was in 5th grade. This is like 5th grade, 6th grade year.
I've heard bits and pieces of the story, but I've never heard the whole thing.
Yeah, she drags me to church, and I fell in love with it.
And just so you guys know, like Vince and I have been friends since you were probably 15. I was 16.
Freshman in
I
high
was
school,
16
yeah.
or 17. We're either a year or 2 years apart, depending on the months. Right
sure.
now we're only a year apart. He's almost 40. So.
I am moving that
But I'll
way.
turn 41 before he turns 40. So it is
Time
what it is.
flies.
But we were friends in high school, and then we got closer and closer. We've been best friends since then, and we're in our 40s. I'm in my
Yeah,
40s.
you're in your 40s.
You're still in your 30s.
I'm still in my 30s.
But
man.
so the backstory is that I know a lot about Vince's life, but I don't know this story. I don't know.
Yeah. So she ends up saying, "Hey, like I want to take you to church. I'm falling in love." I become.
But I know who Donna is.
Right, okay, yeah.
And Steve and.
Oh yeah,
I know.
Stevie, and Stevie was crazy by
Yeah,
the way.
oh,
Like yeah, so he
100%.
deserved the fence kicking thing. I
for
always say
sure.
to this day, like he deserved that.
So you don't know this, but I used to watch like 5 or 6 kids for a Sunday night program that they had,
Right.
and he was in that program.
Oh man,
And I didn't know what to do with this kid. He was just like a couple years younger than me, and I was just like, "What is it? What do I do with this kid?"
he was
doing
wild.
whatever he wanted to do, and I was like, "Just do whatever you need to do. Stay out of here." And it was pretty funny.
But he ended up being one of my really close friends at the time. We're going
Yeah.
through and ended up becoming part of our little bicycle game,
Yeah.
right? And
That's all I wanted. He was just hurling insults at you the whole time. He just wanted to hang out. you know?
Definitely.
There's
Just
a
wanted-
lesson there.
one of the guys. And so anyways, so in going to that, she brought me to church, and it was her ministry to bring me to church. I wouldn't have said that at the time. Like I never said, well, that's her ministry.
Mm-hmm. Right, yeah.
But at that time, like looking back, I'm like, that was her ministry to take this crazy neighborhood kid to
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's
church
pretty
every
wild.
week. And every week, like clockwork, she would come pick me up on Wednesdays and Sundays until I got to the point where I could ride my bike to church, right? And then I could just go on my own. But the church was down the street, so it was
Right.
like really convenient.
Right.
And so I went there, and in going there, yeah, I found Christ. Like I found God, and you know, and when I say that, being younger, you know, my idea of what God was and who He became obviously changed over time. But I remember in junior high, the youth pastor at the time presented Jesus in a very practical way that I could understand from my junior
Right.
high brain.
Yeah.
And I accepted Christ in junior high through at Valley Bible Fellowship. And man, the rest is history. I've been going there ever since. And
Well, it's not history.
I mean, but I'm just
It's
saying,
up and
like,
down. It's
my-
interesting.
yeah.
Because I mean, I've known you for a long time, and I know your story a little bit past that.
oh, for sure.
And feel free to ask me questions too if you want. But I know that through the ups and downs, you've never lost faith since then. And I know
sure.
you've probably been tempted to. You talk about the youth pastor. He went through some big trials and
Right.
Disappointed some people. And, like pastors sometimes do. They're human. They make mistakes.
Right.
And so there's that. And there's many other things that I know have happened in your life where it's like you could easily ask the question, why, God, would you allow this to happen? Or why, God? A lot of people ask, why did God cause these things? Which I don't think God causes things, but he allows life to run its course, right? And so have there ever been any times, you don't have to give specifics, but have there ever been any times where you felt like you're just kind of over this whole faith thing, or over this whole Christianity thing, or over the whole church thing, and you're like, I want to give up on it, but then something comes, you know what I mean? And you're like, I want to get back into it now. Like, have you ever went through that process, or did you never give up? I don't know. I don't want to assume that you're thinking.
Right.
anything.
No, because you know me really, really well. So
Right.
there's a lot of stories. I don't think it's interesting because I think if you take the whole, and I mean, we're still actively living out our faith. So there's
Right.
things that constantly come. But I think if you take that whole thing, I've ever been to a place where I wanted to walk away from God. And I would probably say not walk away from God. There's been times where I've been upset, but not completely walk away with faith, because the times that have been like the hard times, I should say, and then it's not like this for everyone.
Right.
There's a lot less of those hard times than there are just like normal or just, I would say, good times, right? Or like there's a lot, the balance is so much on the other side, but I would definitely say like the enemy takes advantage of those down times, right? When you're like have a lot of questions about your faith or things that you're going through. But
Unmet expectations or
right, I think I would say I've been
disappointments.
more disappointed in myself as a Christian.
Right.
Growing up, my parents got divorced right after I accepted Christ, which was pretty crazy. Like my parents were together when I started going to church, and through that, like my parents got divorced right after I had got saved, and the youth pastor at the time kind of really in 8th grade, at 7th to 8th grade year, that really put a strain on because you go to church and you think like God's gonna fix everything, right? Like it's gonna get better. You're kind of in your mind, and again, as a junior higher, you don't understand it all, but you're kind of sold the idea that things get better when you accept God, right? And as a junior higher, when you say things get better, you're thinking, well, life is going to get better. There's going to be no more hurt, no more problems and things.
Right.
And then immediately, my parents start going through this divorce, and that kind of rattled me for a minute. I thought I thought God was supposed to make things better, but it never ever made me think that God wasn't real.
Right.
In fact, I would always say, like, even before I started going to church, I knew that there was a God, which is so weird to even say because my parents never told me about it. No one ever said like, hey, God's real. I just kind of like always assumed God was real. Maybe, and now that I'm like thinking about it out loud, I can't even like tell you why I always thought that. But I remember as a kid being scared one day. This is like way pre-church. I was like in 3rd grade. Super scared. I think my parents let me watch Chucky or something. My parents would let me watch whatever. We would watch some pretty gnarly movies.
Whatever. Go for it. Yeah,
For sure.
So-
Again, if you
so
know my
effective.
dad, you know my dad. If you know, then you know. And so I remember like sitting in my bed one night. I'm just freaking out my mind, and I'm like, God, please help me tonight. Just have a good night's sleep, I do remember early on, my parents were telling me that praying before bed. And I asked them one day, like, hey, why do people pray? And they're like, oh, you're supposed to pray. And they prayed, down I lay me, down to sleep. I prayed. That was kind of like the prayer I knew going into that. So the first time I got in trouble at church, this is a funny story, Vicky, this is me, myself and Steve Ratliff got in trouble at church. And she goes, we're going to pray. And she's like, Vince, I want you to pray. And I just looked at her and I said, I don't know how to pray. I was like, that's a real story with Vicky. And she looked at me, and I know, like, I'm just imagining what she's going through her mind now as an adult. But she looked at me and was like, okay, like, let's step back. Like, the trouble thing kind of faded away, and she kind of explained prayer to me and that whole thing. But I always had this belief in God. Like, I knew that God was real. So, like, even when things got hard, it was never like, is God real or not real? It was just having a better understanding of who God was. I always think that my understanding of God, especially as a younger Christian, was always, what's the word I want to use? Always growing, I guess. Always in a process, because I was still expanding, because I always thought like, well, when I first got saved, I was like, God's going to fix everything. And then I realized he wasn't. And then it kind of kept expanding from there and understanding who God was in my life.
Well, I think both of us have, we've had lots of conversations about our distaste for dogmatic people in the church, I think. And and when people just say I've figured God out, like they don't say that, but they have this attitude of I know what God's doing. I know
Right.
who He is. I think I've always had a distaste for that, and I think you have too, because we see this expansion, we see this growth, we see like the fact that God isn't something to be fully understood. God is someone that we have a relationship with,
Right.
and he leads us into bigger pastures. And I think you and I always think that the best is yet to come.
Right.
It's always around the corner. It's always bigger and better, and it has gotten better. It really has. A funny story with Vince and I is this is years later. After we started hanging out in high school, I was newly single. I had a long-term relationship and it broke up with this girl. And Vince, I don't know what he was doing with his life, but we were both bored out of our minds. And one day, I was like, dude, let's just go to Magic Mountain. So we went to Magic Mountain and we rode some rides and had some fun. And I remember there used to be a Panda Express at this Magic Mountain. At Magic Mountain. And I remember going there and we got some Chinese food and I had a fortune cookie and I was grabbing it. He's all, you're all, break me off a piece of that. I was like, what? Okay. So I broke him off a piece of it. I gave him half, I took half, and then I read the fortune and it said, this partnership shall prove successful. And I started being blown away. I was like, what the heck, dude? What does that mean? And ever since then, we've like worked together and we've done some things that I think are important and are good. And so here we are now, still working together. And it's been fun through the years because people think we argue a lot, but like we always bounce ideas off of each other. And when I'm upset, Vince always like has something good to say. And when he's upset, sometimes I make it a little worse, and then finally, eventually, I'll bring it back. But it's like I think that having a friend that doesn't always tell you what you want to hear has been really cool over the years.
Definitely.
And having somebody that tells you the truth that you know you can rely on has been cool over the years. And so that's what. To me, that's the blend of like belief in God, because I felt the same way my whole life. I was taught a lot about God as a young person, but that caused a lot of doubt too, because I didn't understand what I was taught versus what I actually saw being lived out. Like I had a hard time understanding it all when I was a kid. And so like I had faith, but like you get older and you have this faith, but then you need to blend it with community. And I think that God brings people into our lives to help us with that. And that's the kind of my point, I guess.
Well, and it's interesting because like there was times where no one made me go to church. My dad never made me go to church in high school. No one forced me. No one woke me up on Sunday and said, we're doing this.
Right.
I did it. Like I wanted to go. It was something I sincerely believe in. And to think the high school me woke up and went to church on a Sunday morning blows my mind. You know, like why did I do that?
I remember you driving yourself.
I drove myself, you know, had my little Volkswagen and would be stoked to go to church.
And there's a social aspect to it too, but I think
definitely. But I would have got the social no matter what, you know, like I would have kept those friends and had friends and I had friends. I went to a couple high schools and I had friends from those different high schools, but it was more that I really, and like you said, you're talking about the religious part of things. There was a point, I think, in my walk with God early on that I believe that if I didn't go to church, bad things would happen.
Right.
Like it would be like the opposite effect of that. Yep. And I lived in that for a little bit. Like if I don't listen to Christian music, if I'm not in my Bible, if I'm not going every week, then like God's wrath is going to pour on me. So like there was this guilt part of my life that I kind of went through, was like I felt guilty about not going.
I think a lot of people feel that way still.
Yeah,
it's weird.
Well, why do you think that? Well, take it from your perspective, because you're on the opposite end of the spectrum. You had to. Somebody woke you up every Sunday, made you go to church. Whether you know, you can say, well, you know, I could have or could not have. You kind of were raised in a house that you know your dad's like, hey, if you live in my house, you're going to go to church every Sunday.
Yeah, I didn't have a choice. Yeah, I was forced to go to church.
Right,
100%.
For the good or the bad, right?
Yeah.
I didn't have somebody saying like, I wish there would have been somebody early on saying, hey, this is good for you.
Right.
But I didn't have that. So like talk about that for like what having a perspective of, you know, not being
so I grew
having
up
the option.
Never having a problem with God, always being okay with God, but having a major problem with church.
Okay.
Because not because I was forced to go. I think I enjoyed going. I think that it was a social thing for me to an extent. But same thing. Like I always knew there was something bigger behind what we were doing. But I think my biggest issue was I always thought that the church was not a good reflection of who God was to me. Growing up, I always had a sense that God was loving and forgiving and good, and I didn't see the church people as always being loving and forgiving and good. I saw a disconnect there. So my issues, if I had any, were toward certain church people, especially in leadership, that I felt like they were just too dogmatic and too authoritarian, and they tried to push that guilt and that fear on us. And so I had to get to a point later in life, probably, I mean, I don't even know when I came to the point where I realized that church is actually a good thing. And it was probably in the last 15 years, where I really started to understand that it was a work in progress,
right?
And that there's different levels of maturity with people. So sorry, what was the question again? The question
No,
was,
I just said because you had the opposite experience of like you didn't get up and go because you wanted to necessarily. Not that you didn't want to go.
So I think that the similarities that you and I had and some of our other friends is that we knew God was with us throughout our whole entire life because God was, and he came to us, and he was with us. Like the most faith I've ever felt in my life is when I'm out hiking in the woods by myself. And when I was a kid, I would do that, and I felt close to God. You know what I mean? And yes, it's because I was taught that God was real, and so that probably had a lot to do with my belief in God.
Right.
But at some point, it became personal to me.
Right.
And so I guess at that point, that's when I looked at the church and thought, that doesn't represent what I'm feeling here. And so that was hard for me. And so at one point I did feel like leaving the church. I felt like when I had the choice to go eventually, I was like, I'm out. I don't want to do this anymore.
Right.
I went away to college for a short stint, and I had the choice of whether I wanted to go to church for the first time in my life. And I went sometimes, and sometimes I didn't. But during that time, I met another guy who's actually a pastor in LA now, Fearless Church, and his name's Jeremy. And he had a huge impact on me in a short amount of time. And I saw somebody who loved God and loved people at the same time. And I hadn't seen that before. I had, but I hadn't seen a good example of somebody my age that loved God and loved people like he did. And I was like, this is legit. What he's doing is correct and right. He wasn't perfect by any means, but he loved God and loved the people around him. And so I got back and I got involved in youth ministry, mainly because I just needed a job. And my dad's like, you want a job? I'm like, yeah, that's fine. And I had a dirt bike and stuff and a truck. So I was like, I have to pay the payments on these. So yeah, I'll take a job. That's fine.
And you were like an assistant out there for a while.
Yeah, I was just helping out.
Yeah.
And then I started really caring for the younger people. And I started understanding that how I represent God is going to matter to them, just like the people that represented God to me matter to me. And so I guess at that point I was like, I could leave, go do my own thing, or I could stay, because I think that what happens is people that are sincere end up losing faith and losing their love for the church because they get disappointed, so they end up leaving.
Right.
And then the church is without that person. And so I was like, I don't want to be that person that just bails on something because I don't think it's right. I want to stay and I want to make a difference. And so then I started doing ministry, and then I never stopped hanging out with you. You weren't involved in church at that point.
Right.
Really.
Well, you reeled me in. You're like, hey, I think you just thought my personality just of being loud and wanting to be in party mode all the time. You're like, that'll be good for the kids.
Right. I mean, honestly, I just never thought I was supposed to. I never felt like it was right to abandon my friends. So I held on to my friends no matter what. Certain friends, I felt like it was really important for me to hold on to those relationships, and also do what I was doing. And so I had this kind of parallel universe for a second, and you ended up joining me on it.
Right.
And I think you did the same thing that I did. You matched your faith with God with this love for these kids. And you realized that you had went through, to bring it back full circle, you realized you had went through this hard time in life, and people were there for you.
Right.
And even though your youth pastors weren't perfect, they loved you, and you're like, I feel this big brother thing, this big sister thing, whatever it is.
Yeah.
And then growing up, we're like, okay, well, we're gonna stick with this, even though we don't. Still to this day, I feel like I'm a black sheep. I feel like I don't fully belong in church, right? But at the same time, I feel like that's where I'm supposed to be involved, but also not turning my back on other people, that aren't involved. I love hanging out with people that aren't in the church,
Well, Devin, I think, and when you say that, I love because you have this, you kind of hated, you're the idea of the church and the religious part of it, right? And, but I'm with you on that. I definitely didn't have this dislike for church or anything.
Let me go back and say, so let me correct you on that, because I want to make sure that I'm representing what I'm trying to say. I have no problem with religious things. Like I have no problem with like singing a song in church or praying with prayer time or whatever, because that's how people see religion. I have a problem when religion goes to people's heads and they start trying to push their convictions on other people.
Right.
I've always had a problem with that. So when I preach and speak, like I'm not telling people what to do in their lives. I'm introducing them to a God. I'm trying to help them understand God better, and I want them to form their own values based on the Bible, based on God, but not based on what I tell them to do. Because I think that could easily turn into that fear-based type of leadership. Does that make sense?
Right. Well, early on, I definitely had this sense that church was important. I went, and I still obviously think it's really, really important. And, when Jim Cruz was actually, and there was nothing wrong with Jim Cruz, by the way, but Jim Cruz ended up being my high school pastor for a while before he ended up in adult ministry. You said the youth pastors that I dealt with.
Adult ministry.
Yeah.
You got to finish that term.
Adult ministry. What did I say?
Well, you just said adult, and I was like, well, you want to make sure that you finish that thought.
You went into adult, yeah. You went into adult ministry, and But you said my youth pastors were imperfect, and you weren't referring to Jim.
No,
but we can't. But he is imperfect too. So
no, but yeah, they all were. They all
no
had
one's
their quirks,
perfect,
right?
Yeah. But anyways, but Jim was my. But I can't. Jim spoke a lot of good words in my life, but I think I always saw God through the relationships I had with people. Like you said, community was important, and I think that is what kind of church molded into. I didn't see God necessarily through these big religious words, and even though those were important, it was always the people reflecting God back to me, through the way that they lived and the things that they did and how they treated one another.
Right.
That was always really, really important to me. And so in seeing that, like you said, seeing people's lives being transformed was more attractive than just opening up the Word of God. And I'm not saying obviously the Word of God is the Word of God, but it was seeing the two kind of come together was a big moment. It was wow, people are, like you said, are living this out. Yeah. I can see it in their lives. There's like when they say women get pregnant, they glow, right? There was a glow about these people that would not only take the words that were religious, right? You could say, but they also lived it out. Yeah. And that was really, I always thought that was okay, I want to be a part of that.
Definitely. And taking a guy like Jim, one of the things he did for me was he would be so persistent. I even did the same thing with you, of getting us to camp, to Hume Lake, right? So persistent. He wouldn't let us go. He just was I'll pay for your trip, whatever it takes. And we're okay, all right, and we would end up going. And it was always a huge experience for us. It was always a touching experience because they had. Francis Chan was one of our speakers up there, right?
Yeah, multiple times.
Yeah. So every year we're this guy's cool. He's really neat. We had no idea he was going to be this famous pastor, but during those times, it was halfway in, halfway out. But at least we were halfway in. There's that scripture of "Don't be lukewarm," but I don't think that pertains to these young kids where it's look, if you're halfway in the door, thank God you're halfway in the door. I don't think that's a bad thing. I think that that sometimes we shame kids for not being religious when they're just kids, man. They're trying to figure life out. And thank God that the people around us gave us the opportunity to grow and still do.
Well, it's exactly what you said, the people around us. Because you said, well, why haven't you fallen away from God? And I think it had to do with my community, right? It was the people around me. There was no way you were going to let me completely fall off. Even if you knew hey, Vince needs to go, just be Vince for a minute.
Right.
You were always still hey, you okay, man? You doing good? Bo was one of those guys that was around at that time. There's just a lot of guys that we had.
And we had a lot of hope in our conversations, a lot of what ifs, and what if this, what if that? And there was always positive. We always believed in a better future, and we always believed in the people around us and this growth and this calling from God, and I still do. And I think that's another thing that keeps me moving forward. We were going to talk about motivation originally, but I was let's just talk about our stories first. And I think that's a huge part of motivation is just constantly believing that God has something good in the future for us, and that He has he's gonna lead us to a place that's better than we are here and now.
Do you think it's harder to stay motivated or connected though if you don't have that community around you?
100%. Yeah, I think that community is key, and it doesn't have to be a big community. When I think of community, we have a big church, right? And my dad's the pastor of that church, and so I've grown up in this huge community, but it's the micro community, the 5 or 6 people in my life that I'm constantly in contact with, and now that includes our wives and my wife and your wife and these other couples that we hang out with, and I have this strong knit community that is accountability, and it's where I find comfort. It's where I find help. It's where I find growing opportunities. Where
Right.
it's just good. It's crucial. It really is.
Right.
And we all have different Bible studies and stuff we belong to. We don't have like one Bible study or anything, but we're family is what it is. And
Right.
I think without having a family in church or whatever, but people go to church or not, a family of believers and a family of people who have faith not only in God, but we all have faith in each other. I think that makes every bit of difference.
Right. Well, and in going back to that, like having that community, that close-knit family, sometimes, and I say this like very carefully, sometimes you come to church and you kind of get in with a group of people and you find out like that's not really the people you were meant to connect with in the beginning, whether you get thrown into a Bible
Right.
study. And so I would say like if you're going to church, you're staying like sometimes your community, like when you're out serving, when you're out doing it, kind of finds, you know what I mean? Like it kind of naturally happens. It's not something you have to force upon.
Right.
Would you say like?
Yeah, I think that when it's organic, it's not always perfect, but it's right. And that's what it needs to be. I think that's what your relationship with God should be. I think that's what your relationship with each other should be. My friend, that Jeremy guy, I just listened to part of his message the other day, and he said something I used to say all the time, that the church is not an organization, but it's an organism. And organisms, they move and they grow and they have growing pains, and there's all these things that happen. And I think that in community and in a church community especially, there's a reason why Paul said that we're like a body. We're like the body
Right.
of Christ. There's growing pains and there's movement and there's all this like different things that happen where it just has to be authentic. It really honestly
Right.
does. Like even today, I'm like, will you sit down and have a conversation with me? You're like, well, I don't want to do the church conversation.
I didn't say it like
no,
that.
No, you
Come
said
on.
you said you didn't want me to force you to talk about things, and I get that. I
No,
understand that,
it was
but-
just like, yeah, I want it to be more organic.
But I know you have something good to give,
for sure.
and I'm like, let's
Well,
just
I mean,
do
yeah.
it, in front of everybody who wants to watch it,
Well, okay, so let's talk about this for a second, because I love that we're kind of talking about relationships, community, because I do think that's really, really important, and why you kind of stay with faith. Not that God
Fancy.
isn't.
These are cool mugs, by the way. They're like
Yeah,
artsy mugs.
I picked them out. You said go pick out two
Yeah,
mugs,
you
and I
picked
did.
out two really cool artsy,
Yeah.
hand dipped.
They're like a Easter egg dipped.
Easter egg mugs.
Yeah,
They're really
Easter
cool.
egg mugs. So in organic relationships, I would call our friendship an unlikely friendship. And I like this conversation. I always think about this. Because I never would have, like, if we would have went to youth group, it's like, hey, go find somebody you don't know. I wouldn't have gravitated towards you in high school. And the reason why...
That's fair. Yeah.
And the reason why it would have been because you're a little bit more preppy than
I was
me.
a jock, man.
You were a little, and also, I would, in my mind, you were a lot more religious because of your dad. Like,
Sure.
hey, that's the pastor's son.
Yeah.
I have nothing in common with that guy, and I don't really want him to know what I'm doing on the weekends, kind of person,
Sure.
right?
Yeah.
Because like you knew
You
this
still
side of
treated me like that years after we were friends, but it's fine.
Well, I had like some friends that wanted to cause some trouble, and I never wanted to pull you into that side, and you knew what I was up to, and you'd be like, hey, where were you this weekend? But a very unlikely relationship. But it happened.
Now you do that with me.
Right? Yeah. I'm like, where are you at, man? Like, what's going on? But a very unlikely relationship. Something that you couldn't have just picked
Right.
two people from opposite ends of spectrum. I think. Again, I wasn't raised in church. My parents, again, come from completely different family dynamics in some way. And one day you invited me out to lunch. I was just running around campus. I think I wanted to go to lunch, and you're like, "Hey, you want to sneak off campus?" And I'm like, "Yeah, let's do that." And I didn't care at the time. I was kind of like in no care mode. And we went to 7-Eleven, and I think you found this like freedom that I had that you were like, "That's kind of cool," because I went into 7-Eleven and wheezed the juice. And if you don't know what wheeze the juice is, just Google that.
Yeah, he drank out of the Slurpee machine.
You can't do that in COVID anymore.
Yeah,
you can't just put your mouth up.
Not
to
cool in a pandemic, but I thought it was funny, and I thought this kid's really funny.
Yeah, but in that it was kind of like this, like, I always thought it was funny because I would go over your house. I love this story, and this is a good story with your dad. I would go over your house, and you'd invite me to stay the night. This is like when kids hung out and stuff. They didn't just play video games.
Right,
You're like,
yeah.
hey, you want to stay the night? We'll hang out. I'm like, yeah, it sounds fun. And we ended up like causing some trouble at night. And I remember your dad coming in one night and like, what are you guys up here laughing all night for? I have business to do in the morning.
Right,
and in my mind, I'm like, what do you got to do on a Sunday morning? Like, you know, like what's going on?
It's Saturday night.
It's Saturday night.
Like speaking
we're laughing. You know, he's in there trying to sleep because he has to go and teach on Sunday morning. And
he's stressed out of his mind.
Again, but it was cool because, like I said, an unlikely relationship, unlikely friendship. But God organically brought us together, and I think in that I was able to see a lot of God in you. Not like when you woke up and you would read devotions and do all this stuff, but mostly in like you making really honest decisions. Like I will say, not to but like you're one of the most honest people I know. Like to a fault sometimes. I'm like, Josh, don't say that.
Right.
Like like you'll just say, and that's like that was one characteristic that I knew early on. Like I had relationships in my life with my family, things no one ever gave it to me 100, and it was like nice for somebody just to say this is exactly what it is, you know. And so and that was a God trait. That wasn't something you could do on your own. It was just like, hey, I want to be very transparent who I am. I want to be 100% honest. Right. And so seeing God in a natural relationship, not just like in some forced Bible relationship, was good. And I think when we come to church, we meet these people that are going to be unlikely. Like we would never put ourselves in a Bible study with them or put ourselves in life with them. And then all of a sudden, you know, you have an Adrian Monge show up at your door. Monet show up at your doorstep. Or you have, you know, a John Ranger. You have, you know, all these different people that are in our. I'm like, I never would have thought
that have completely different backgrounds.
But
there's a connection, and it's a God connection. I think one of the things that I admired about you is that you were the get things done guy, you know, for better or for worse. When we were young,
for good or bad,
I was the instigator, and I'd be like, it'd be funny if somebody did this thing, which was usually...
You knew what you were doing,
usually like a crime, and you would do it, and I would laugh. I was entertained by it. But now it's like, man, Vince, can we pull this off, or can we pull that off? And you get excited and you get it done. And not that I always tell you what to do, because you come up with ideas all the time, but it's like we worked well together when it comes to that stuff. I think that that God knew what he was doing. It was like, these guys are knuckleheads. They're going to fight a lot. They're going to disagree a lot. But at the end, like, they're going to grow together. And we do have a handful of other people in our lives that are connected to us. And that's our community, you know.
Right.
It's a community where people do tell each other the truth, but people do care about each other. And it has to happen that way. It really does. We all have faith in God. We all disagree on what that means sometimes. Sometimes we agree and sometimes we disagree, but that's okay. I think that's one of the most beautiful things about having a community of people that accept you, because they were accepted, right?
Right. But isn't that where a lot of going into the motivation kind of thought of this? Mm-hmm. Isn't that what kind of keeps you motivated? Like, I get motivated to know that you're stoked about doing something. It motivates me to back you in this thought that you have. And I get motivated to back Al in his outreaches. And I get motivated to back Seth when he has this really cool, like, because I'm like, it's my community. I get motivated to build the community.
Well, you get stoked from people when other people get pumped about something.
For sure.
And you like seeing people take initiative. And I think one of your biggest complaints about people is when they just sit around and do nothing. And but a lot of people do. They get paralyzed and they get afraid, and because of that fear, they do nothing. And we've always had the philosophy, I think, that it's better to do something that's wrong than it is to do nothing.
Right.
And so I like to see that. I would like to see that continue in the expansion of the communities around us, that everybody that's watching this would understand the importance of just pushing forward and having people to accept you regardless of the outcome, you know, whether something's going to be, whether it's going to be good or not, and just working together on it. I think one of the things that, like, you see, we were old enough and young enough to see the explosion of Silicon Valley.
Oh, yeah.
We were old, you know, like, we saw the growth of the internet, tech companies and all stuff. And I think one of the things that those companies have always done so well is they're so good at working together and failing together well. And I think that that's one of the things that church, for some reason, churches don't don't do that well. And
Right.
we should be
Right.
vulnerable enough to say, hey, I got this idea. I don't know if it's going to work. Will you work on this with me? And yes, let's get this done. And we work on something, and then we're like, that didn't work out.
Right.
But what did we learn from it?
Right.
And then you gather that intel, and then you apply that to the next project. And I think that we're still in that phase right now of life where we're still trying to figure those things out. But I think one of these days, like, something's going to blow up. I do believe that. I 100% believe that as we continue to work and reconfigure, I think, our ideas, like, it's going to happen. It's, going to explode. And then what's funny is I say it's going to happen like this one big thing, like overnight, what is happening is we're growing slowly too. And we're getting hopefully better, but we're also getting to a place where we understand the needs of the people more, and we're understanding what people actually desire. And I think that one of the things that people desire the most is just authenticity,
For sure.
And that's something that we found.
Yeah.
If there's anything we have found authenticity.
sure.
We're not fake. And
Right. And I think sometimes people, it's funny you say, I think sometimes people would rather you be fake because it's like, oh, at least, like,
it's more comfortable.
it's more comfortable. I think
Yeah.
people are more comfortable with, instead of just saying like, hey, this is how it is, or this is who I am, and exposing yourself. It's more comfortable to be
Have you ever talked to somebody that every single time you see them, they say the same thing? It's like they have like an autopilot mode where they just like, hey, how's it going? How you been lately? And oh, cool, yeah, I'm still doing this thing. It's like this auto mode. I can't stand that because like life isn't.
But
like
have you
that.
found yourself in that auto mode before? Right? Yeah, definitely.
Because it's easier.
Yeah,
It's easier to be in that.
Man, same-o, same-o.
Yeah. It's like instead of somebody like walking up to somebody and say, "How are you doing?" Well, let me tell you. Today it's blah blah blah. Like that takes more energy and more effort.
And it can get messy, and it's stuff that we don't. Yeah.
But if we were a little bit more like that, a little bit more honest and real, you'd probably get somewhere. Like you mentioned, John Ranger. He's been going through a tough time with some personal things that's been going on that happened to him. And I just was talking to him the other day, and he opened right up, and we had an amazing conversation. And hopefully we'll get to talk about that more as we do more of these conversations. But I guess my biggest spiel is just be honest, be real, and find people that you can be honest and be real with, and have tough conversations, have difficult conversations. There are plenty of days, Vince and I are close, and we work together, and there are plenty of days where I know we're not going to talk about anything deep, and that's okay. But then there are times where, like, if I need to talk about something, I'm like, hey, I need to talk about this today. And he'll do the same thing. And it's just important to have that in the church. That's what the body of Christ should be, I think. Not this, not all about religion, but about community and sharing your heart, like opening up your heart, saying, here it is on the table. Not every day, not all the time.
Right.
A lot of times we goof off, we laugh.
Right.
But sometimes you need to do that, and you need to have people that you can trust to do that with.
Yep.
So I think we've been talking for a minute. So anyway, we'll keep this going. We're gonna keep talking to other people. Vince is gonna be here talking to other people too. I know it. So hopefully, but he's usually behind the scenes, shooting all this stuff and creating all this media. But I appreciate you for sitting down with me, man.
Heck yeah.
Even though you weren't feeling it at
I
first.
wasn't, but it's all right.
That's
It
all
worked
right.
out.
All right. Thanks, guys.